when we get to some of the early travellers in the earlier part of the 19th century. Basically, the ancient Egyptian language written in hieroglyphs had died out in around the end of the 4th century AD. In fact, had been fairly ill for a while before then, as gradually the rise of Christianity ate away at Egyptian paganism, which really was the fundamental basis for the script. Although there is nothing specifically religious about hieroglyphs themselves, they were intimately associated with what we might call the ancient regime in Egypt. And thus, by the 4th century, use of hieroglyphs had become more and more restricted to the few pagan temples left open, in particular the famous temples at Philae in the south of Egypt. And it was there in 394 AD that the very last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved. This rather disreputable piece in one of the side rooms of the Philae temple. From that point onwards, all that really was known, what was knowable, was what had been preserved in the writings of particularly the classical authors. But really everything had been, was with the arrival of the triumph of Christianity, with the Theodosius, really that was the end of ancient Egypt. And the buildings which survived tended to be those which had been adapted in some way for Christianity. For example, in the Wadi Sebwakon temple in Nubia, the inner part was turned into a church by the virtue of whitewashing over the original reliefs and adding Christian iconography. This had a rather amusing result in this particular case, where the whitewash has fallen off in one place but not elsewhere, showing Ramesses II worshipping St. Peter, allegedly. Not only the triumph of Christianity, but also the arrival of Islam further undermined any real links with the past, which was regards to the time of ignorance. And although there was some work by Arab scholars on ancient Egypt, including speculations about the reading of hieroglyphs, really from the point of view of on the ground research in Egypt, ancient Egyptian history was effectively dead. And the buildings were used as quarries. And for example, here we've got a part of an Egyptian door jamb, which has been reused as the threshold of this particular mosque in Cairo. So that's really where ancient Egypt had got to. The only places one could access ancient Egypt was, as I say, through the classical authors, particularly Manetho, who produced a chronicle of the kings of Egypt, originally for Ptolemy III in the 3rd century BC. Also the works of travellers like Herodotus and Diodorus, and also the material which was contained in the Bible. And therefore, down to the beginning of the 19th century, pretty well all that could be written about the history of ancient Egypt was an amalgam of these sources, with in some ways the Bible given in some ways priority owing to the religious views of the time. But effectively you end up with a mishmash which bears very little resemblance to what we would see today as being Egyptian history, although the basic dynastic structure which we use today had been created by Manetho, and therefore underneath the various accretions, at least to some degree, there was a structure which we would recognize today, but the detail completely different, and no understanding really of what the chronology of it all actually was. As has been stated almost to the level of cliche, it's the arrival of the Napoleonic Expedition in Egypt into Egypt in 1798 that starts moving things on, both from the point of view of the production of the great Description de l'Egypte, which provided amongst the first reliable copies of and representations of Egyptian monuments, although a few earlier travellers, particularly people like Pocock and Norden, had produced some tolerable plans and depictions of the monuments during the previous century. And therefore, so this in many ways kicks things off. But even when these volumes first appear, there is not much one can say about creating a new history, because nobody at this stage could actually read any of the texts which were on the monuments which are here published. Again, as everybody was well aware, one of the discoveries of the Napoleonic expedition was the Rosetta Stone, a fragment of a trilingual inscription from the reign of Ptolemy V, which had texts in hieroglyphic Egyptian, Demotic Egyptian, and in Greek. Demotic being the handwritten version of the ancient Egyptian language, which was current during the period from about 600 BC onwards, and ran in parallel with hieroglyphs, although hieroglyphs by then were largely used for, we might call, sacred inscriptions, with Demotic being the more workaday kind of language. But by the fact that this is a trilingual inscription, including the section in Greek, which makes it quite clear this is the same text in each of the languages, therefore that allowed the first attempts to be made at trying to read hieroglyphs, and also read Demotic for that matter, and finally be able to investigate about what the ancient Egyptians could say for themselves about their history, rather than having to see it through the lens of Greek and biblical writers. And therefore, during the first couple of decades of the 19th century, two individuals, Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion, worked on the material, primarily from the Rosetta Stone, but not entirely, to try and produce some of the earliest interpretations of how it might all work, which actually had some kind of meaning. There is, of course, a great debate over the relative roles of these two individuals. Thomas Young got a certain way, but clearly it was clear from his working methods that there's no way he could have actually got a step beyond. He was able to isolate individual words and sometimes even letters in hieroglyphs, but would not necessarily be able to understand why they read that way or anything about the grammar of it. It was the ability of Jean-François Champollion, who published his initial results in 1822, to be able to take the step forward which would allow further work. It's important to recognise, though, that his 1822 work, and even that in the following years, was by no means gave people the ability to read Egyptian texts. What it allowed them to do was to isolate words, be able to read names, but certainly not to be able to read connected texts. That wouldn't be possible for another couple of decades for them to be able to get to that kind of level. So it's worthwhile recognising that in the 1820s, which is when really what I'm fundamentally talking about here into the 1830s, the ability to make stuff from the inscriptions which are now being looked at was limited. However, it's actually remarkable, given the limitations again under which they were working, how much it was possible to get out of that limited amount, and that actually by the end of the 1830s, a tolerable, at least, sequence of pharaohs, back for a couple of thousand years anyway, had been created, and on the basis of original Egyptian sources. Now, up until the end of the 1820s, the end of the 1810s, shall we say, the only source to order Egyptian royal names came from Manetho's Greek work, which had suffered both from issues of his sources and also the fact that the names were all attempted to be rendered in Greek, and in some cases horribly mangled in the process. However, in 1819, the first original Egyptian king list was found. This is actually before anybody is actually able to read any of the text, but at least the thing is available and is recognised for what it is. The person responsible for this discovery is William Joseph Banks, a figure who was familiar to many Astini members, and of course was the owner of Kingston Lacy, which is one of the great houses of its time, and has an important role in the whole story of decipherment in the form of the obelisk, which he had brought back from Egypt and was of use to Champollion in his work. But from the point of view of what we're talking about tonight, his discovery was in the temple of Ramesses II at Abydos, what he and his contemporaries all recognised was an original hieroglyphic king list. It is now in the British Museum, having been taken out of the wall some 20 years after Banks's time by the French consul Mimont, and ultimately sold to the British Museum. But here, through the magic of modern software, I have actually placed it back on the wall where it originally was found. It's quite badly damaged, but looking at Banks's original drawings, it doesn't appear to have suffered massively more since his time. So a lot of the damage was clearly done during the partial demolition of the temple in antiquity. This is it as it's now displayed in the British Museum. And what we can see here is that there are a sequence of ovals, the Egyptian cartouches running across there, and we can see parts of 3 registers. Unfortunately, the bottom register, which is the best preserved of them all, is simply Ramesses II's names repeated time after time after time. The actual king list, which in its origins would have been part of an offering formula, with the offering formula being made to all of these ancestral kings. Unfortunately, we have got a lot going along here. We have the end of the list, which ends actually in Ramesses II himself, and then his father, his grandfather Ramesses I, and then into the 18th dynasty. However, as you can see, then it cuts off. And in fact, one of the things which we're now well aware of is that the whole second intermediate period has been missed out by the compiler. In addition, the original compiler has missed out the so-called Amarna kings, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, I, and the others of that group as well. So we actually go back to the 12th dynasty, and then that is cut off. And then the fragments we've got at the top are various obscure kings of the first intermediate period. So even when it was possible to read some of these hieroglyphs, one wasn't actually getting particularly far, because you've got another 2 registers missing from there, and a considerable amount of the whole list missing off to the right. And here actually is a restoration of the missing bits. So you can see an awful lot is missing, including all the very earliest kings in the top row there. Nevertheless, having this thing was useful, and would allow some progress to be made. Other early discoveries, again, really before anybody could make too much out of it, included the work of Lord Prudhoe, later the 4th Duke of Northumberland, who travelled through Egypt and also down into Sudan. And while in Sudan, he went to Jebel Barkal. This is a drawing made a little bit before his visit by Cayor. But here in this, when he travelled here, he discovered a couple, or noted a couple of granite lions, which had been spotted by various earlier travellers, but it was Prudhoe who actually removed them, and they ultimately arrived in London. Although, interestingly enough, we have no actual record of their detailed record of their removal, only odd mentions, and there's still some debate as to exactly their movement when they actually arrived in London. In one of the very earliest Demosthenian meetings, John Ruffle commented that it would be useful if there are any diarists from the early 19th century in London about two granite lions prowling the streets trying to find a home. Anyway, they do end up ultimately in the British Museum. Here we have them. And here we are as they are now in the British Museum. The importance of these was the fact that one of them was inscribed for both Tutankhamun and his grandfather, Amenhotep III. And as I'll explain a little bit later on, this actually played quite an important role in John Gardner Wilkinson's reconstruction of the history of the 18th dynasty. Wilkinson, of course, it will be a familiar figure to many of you, and his long residency in Egypt, particularly in Luxor, gave him an unrivaled insight into the material available. And he, in many ways, is the first scholar to actually do some useful or meaningful work on Egyptian chronology, or at least in the sense of the order of kings, and trying to reconcile the evidence of Manetho with the Abydos list, and also, very importantly, the various cartouches he was seeing on the walls of the temples around Luxor, which he was the unrivaled master of. Now, I mentioned him and the Prudhoe lions. When one of the things he'd noted was very early on, because now we're now getting into the late 1820s and Champollion's initial results are available. One of the things he notes is that this gap in the list, as I already mentioned, that things jump straight from Amenhotep III to Horemheb in the Abydos list. But he was already aware that there were other kings floating around, in particularly through the Prudhoe lions. He couldn't quite read properly what the connection between the two kings who are mentioned on the lions was, but he knew that they had to be close contemporaries. And also he was recognized that Tutankhamun was not on the Abydos list. So he had to start trying to think of reasons why we have got somebody who is clearly associated with Amenhotep III, yet doesn't appear on what it appeared at that stage to be the absolute master list of Egyptian kings from the Egyptian point of view. And what he did was found in the work of Manetho various mentions of potential connections between the kings of the late 18th dynasty and the Greek heroes Danaus and Aegyptus, who were presented as kings of Egypt, who were brothers, who had quarrelled, and that Danaus, the elder of them, had then gone off to Greece to found, or at least refound, the city of Argos. So Wilkinson put two and two together here and thought, well, possibly could it be that Aegyptus is Amenhotep III and Denias is Tutankhamun? And the reason why he's missing from the Abydos list is because he had quarrelled with his brother with whom he was ruling, because he'd come across a block at Karnak which had also had both Tutankhamun and Amenhotep III's name on, but with Tutankhamun's name erased. So all of this for him suggested that these two might well have been the prototypes for the Greek myths, Denias and Aegyptus. And therefore for him, and for quite some time after he first wrote on this in the late 1820s, he regarded that Tutankhamun, shown of course in the much later discovered mask at the top right there, was none other than Denias, the legendary founder of the city of Argos. Now, of course, this all sounds rather bizarre to us today, but it is an indication of how these early researchers were groping in the dark, trying to reconcile what material they had. As I say, they could decipher the cartouches, they could read names, they were able to then cross-refer those to the Abydos list. Also, Wilkinson and some of his contemporaries also were already using where things were carved on walls as the basis for understanding how they might relate to one another. But at the bottom of it, the only narrative accounts they had available to them were the old Greek and biblical ones. So what they had to do was try and shoehorn what they had there into these other sources to try and produce something which looked like history. As I say, this now looks completely ridiculous, but in the terms of what he had before him and on the terms of what he felt was potentially usable, this is what he could do. And in fact, it's something which is worthwhile bearing in mind about when you look at ancient Egyptian history, is it's always a working hypothesis. Everything is up for grabs. Ancient Egyptian history is very much a movable feast. It's not a fixed thing in the way that sort of classical history and medieval and later history is. One new discovery can change everything, and all the time Egyptologists are just trying to make the best story out of the material which is available to them. And that's just what Wilkinson was doing when he first wrote on this at the end of the 1820s. He was using the cutting edge data from the ongoing decipherment of hieroglyphs, along with the archaeological data, as well as the material from classical and biblical sources. Here, say he put two and two together and made 97. However, it was the beginning of trying to actually use a scientific method to try and work out what might have been going on in the remote past. But it was very much here at Karnak where a lot of Wilkinson's work was carried out. So bring to recognizing the building history of this great temple, and from that working out and confirming the ordering of various kings and other individuals. Also at Thebes, on the other side of the river, on western Thebes, here at the Ramesseum, Wilkinson was able to find some more data which helped fill in some of the gaps which there were from the broken Abydos king list. For example, here in the temple, there is an extract from the Festival of Min. And during that festival, the statues of ancient kings were carried in procession. And he was able to see here that the order of the statues back to back to here, beginning of the 18th dynasty, corresponded with the Abydos list, which was a useful ability to cross-refer two different sources to make sure that that there is actually an agreement. And this also had missed out the Amarna kings, so hence his resort to the Denias theory for identifying who Tutankhamun was. But also here, addition to the New Kingdom kings, this procession also included Mentuhotep II of the Middle Kingdom, somebody who is actually missing from the Abydos list because that bit's broken away, and also Mene, or Menes, the legendary founder of the Egyptian monarchy, which he was able to then cross-refer to the works of but not only the work of Manetho, but also to Herodotus and Diodorus, all of whom recognized Menes as the founder of the Egyptian monarchy. And seeing him here at the tail end of this procession of ancestral kings helped confirm that this bit of data was actually accurate from the point of view of the hieroglyphic monuments, as well as those of the classical writers. And there we have the cartouche of Mene or Menes. And all this work culminated in probably the first summary of early Egyptian history, which was produced by Gardner Wilkinson in 1828 and printed at Malta. Over the previous couple of years, Champollion had been producing some historical works based on his efforts in the Turin Museo Egizio in Turin. However, because Wilkinson was in a position to actually work on the monuments, which are standing monuments in front of him, he was able to do quite a bit, which Champollion was never able to do. And in some ways, I would argue that Wilkinson should be regarded as the ultimate father of Egyptian history through the production of his Materia Hieroglyphica in 1828, with a second part coming out in 1830. So we're only a few years after into actually knowing what hieroglyphs even do, and now we've got a good chunk of Egyptian history, or at least a succession of kings in the original hieroglyphs available through this work. And this is just one of the plates from the Materia Hieroglyphica, and here he's placing the kings in a chronological order. And then with variant forms also shown. He's also identifying who the wives of some of these monarchs are. So here we are, so in 1828, with a pretty good list of the kings and queens of the 18th dynasty, basically in the right order, and recognizing what some of the variations in the forms of the royal names. So it's clearly by no means perfect. There are some individuals who are in the wrong place. For example, here, Sir Kenyon Ray of the 17th dynasty is placed in front before the 12th dynasty, but it's all going very much in the right kind of direction. And just another plate and other plates as well. Here he's now going on beyond the point where the Abydos king list cuts off, which is in reign of Ramesses the second, and is able to produce a pretty good king list moving on through the 19th and 20th dynasties. Even some bits of the third intermediate period are there in the right kind of order, with royal kings' names, queens' names, and so on. So really, this is a really quite major achievement to be able to do all of this so early on in the process. Around the same time that Wilkinson is producing this pioneering work, Champollion finally makes it to Egypt, along with Ippolito Rossellini. Here they are in the classic painting in Florence of the Franco-Tuscan expedition, with Rossellini here and Champollion here. Rather different image from the one which we tend to see for the rather sort of the suited, studious-looking individual which is the classic depiction of Champollion. But here we've got him with a rather fearsome beard and an even more fearsome scimitar as well. So another light on Champollion. And this, of course, allowed him to then start seeing some of this material firsthand. But he died relatively soon after the end of the expedition. So Champollion's contributions to the formulation of early history are relatively limited. And in some cases, some of his guesses were wrong, and in fact one of his classic ones is he originally ordered the 25th dynasty in a certain way, which basically by virtue of his standing in the subject, remained in place until about 10 years ago, when it was finally realised he'd got two of the kings the wrong way round. So it's important to recognise how much we owe to these, and how much of our current views are coloured by these very first views taken by these early travelling scholars. Although Champollion did relatively little on history before his premature death, his joint leader of the expedition, Rossellini, did a significant amount of work in publishing the results of the expedition. Actually, the story of the Franco-Tuscan expedition's publication is an interesting one, and the original intention was to produce the same thing in two languages. However, there was a falling out between Rossellini and Champollion's elder brother and literary executor, which resulted in a different divergence. And although there are common features between the French and the Italian versions of the publication, they are by no means the parallel texts which the initial plan was. And it was only the Italian version had the detailed historical discussions, which, although are somewhat later than Wilkinson's, and using a certain amount more data, are in no way particularly better. And certainly some of Wilkinson's ideas have stood the best test of time, more so than those of Rossellini. Now, one thing which had been spotted by Wilkinson and a number of the other early travellers was that there was another source of royal names available over and above the Abydos list. This had been found in what is called the so-called the Festival Hall area, built by Thutmose III at the back of the main temple at Karnak, as we can see here. And as it stands today, we have this little chamber here, which was called the Chamber of Kings, amongst other things. And in it was a set of inscriptions which showed the seated figures of ancient kings with their names associated with them, all being offered to by Thutmose III. This is it, and was recognised as being an important source. Although, as we now sort of perceive it, it's actually in some ways a misleading source, because unlike the Abydos list and some later ones which were found, which had been produced in chronological order by their ancient Egyptian authors, the kings here were not in a proper chronological order. Some of them were in sort of chronological groups, but others weren't. And in fact, what we now think about it is it may actually be a record of statues of ancient kings present at Karnak during Thutmose III's reign, rather than a specific listing of the ancestors had been the case at Abydos. And as a result of the resulting rather odd order, it actually undermined some of the early ideas about how Egyptian history ought to be reconstructed. However, it was recognised as an important thing, and as a result of that, Emile Prudhoe was moved to actually effectively steal it. It was dismantled and smuggled out of Egypt and ended up in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and is now in the Louvre. However, in spite of this rather underhand bit of activity, Prudhoe does actually have wider importance in the development of ancient Egyptian history through other observations while he was in the country. In particular, he was the first person to apparently to note the various Amarna period blocks which were were being found at Karnak. Now, many of you will be aware that during the first half of the 19th century, destruction of ancient monuments wasn't purely down to people of antiquarian bent removing them to Europe. Also, the Egyptian government under Muhammad Ali was in the process of trying to industrialize the country, and in doing so was dismantling ancient buildings for either for lime or simply as the building blocks for sugar refineries and other such things. And in the late 1830s, they actually went so far as to start trying to dismantle parts of Karnak Temple for that purpose, in particular the 9th and 10th pylons at the southern end of the site. Now, those turned out to be that the work was stopped fairly early on. And in fact, when you compare the state of the pylons today with those as depicted in the Napoleonic Expeditions publication, actually, they don't appear to have suffered particularly badly. However, blocks were emerged which were of a style which was almost otherwise unknown, apart from in an obscure place in Middle Egypt, where in 1824, Gardner Wilkinson had first discovered the tombs of the reign of Akhenaten at Amarna. But Prudhoe recognises the importance of these and actually writes to Gardner Wilkinson, who presents this in 1840. So this is the area we're talking about here, and it's these pylons here which were starting to be dismantled, and from which blocks of the Amarna period first emerged. And Prudhoe was actually a very skilled copyist of ancient monuments, as well as quite a good thief of them in his removal of the Karnak king list. And actually, there are two beautiful volumes he produced of copies of Egyptian art, which were republished quite recently in a combined volume by Taschen, edited by Salim Rikram. But among them are these drawings of the blocks which came out of the 10th pylon, including part of what's now known to be a battle relief of Tutankhamun, which have only been recently properly recognised by Ray Johnson, and further blocks identified around Karnak and at Luxor, but also other blocks recognisably bearing the image of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and also some of the more conventional ones of the beginning of the reign of Akhenaten, when he was still Amenhotep IV. So some really important things, even more so because apart from the relief in the top right-hand corner, all of these have now vanished, and it's only by virtue, or at least they have not been identified in the recent past anyway, and without the copies of Pris d'Avon here, these would have been lost, and that's another contribution even to those of the early travellers who were not primarily historians in a way that Pris and Wilkinson, Champollion and Rossellini were, in actually preserving records of monuments which are now either badly damaged or completely destroyed. I say this is the only one which is now, which is still identifiable and is now in the Louvre. By the time we get to into the 1840s proper, things are moving on rapidly in the understanding of hieroglyphs, particularly through Carl Lepsius, the leader of the Prussian expedition, who is shown apparently wearing his nightshirt and waving a bowler hat here on the top of the Great Pyramid at Giza during his expedition. He was one of the first to recognise some of the errors that Champollion had made in his decipherment and was able to push things on further. Also, the expedition was able to recover more material which was relevant to it. So by the time we get to the 1840s, Egyptian history is starting to come much more together, with recognition of developments in style and so on, being able to move on from where the early works of people like Wilkinson. And by the 1850s, something recognisably like the modern history of ancient Egypt was being produced by Henri Rouge. And his history of Egypt really was the standard textbook right down to the end of the 19th century, although getting increasingly obsolete. What we have here, say, it has many things one can recognise as similar to what is now the sort of standard picture of Egyptian history, but much is still to change, and indeed things can change even today in the writing of Egyptian history only over a few years. For example, the book I wrote in 2009, when it came to doing a revised edition 10 years later, had 75% of its pages changed. Not massively, but every year new bits of information come along. But it's important to recognise, I think, the way that modern Egyptological history stands on the shoulders of the early giants, and that without that those initial insights by people like Wilkinson, without people like Prudhoe and Banks recognising important items and bringing them to the attention of people like Wilkinson who could do stuff with them, the history of the development of the Egyptian history would have been far more tortuous than it's ended up being. So hopefully that little brief overview has given you an idea of how Egyptian history started to be written and the important role in starting all that off was played by some of the travellers who our society does so much to investigate. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Absolutely fascinating talk. Nobody has put down any questions. It may be, oh yes, somebody has put down a question.
Somebody's just arrived.
Yes, just come up. Did these early travellers get financial, technical or other support of diplomats present in the country? And if so, how?
The answer is not very much. The diplomats in question, people like Henry Salt and so on, were very keen on doing their own thing. So they provided sort of logistical support on occasion to their fellow countrymen. But it was very much a sort of DIY kind of thing. And certainly there was sort of, some of the, there were attempts at stopping certain things. There's an awful lot of rivalry between these various individuals. And I say, because many of the diplomats fancied themselves as proto-Egyptologists, they often saw some of these people as threats to their own position.
Another one. Sorry.
Yeah. Next one, speaking of new discoveries coming along all the time, I'd love to hear Aidan's take on the new finds at Saqqara. For those who aren't aware of it, in the last couple of years, huge numbers of coffins have been discovered in tombs at Saqqara. All of these date to the late period or the Ptolemaic period, and in many ways are very similar to the sorts of discoveries some of the early travellers are making. These sort of, I think, which actually I think as Tess sort of discussed in her doctoral work, the mummy pits, and I think what they're being found at Saqqara are very much those things. The thing about them is they're all very interesting, but they don't actually help very much for anybody who's looking at it from historical point of view, because they are all of individuals who we've got no other knowledge of or ability to actually place properly in time. One of the annoyances of that particular group of material is that almost none of the individuals have anything on their coffins linking them into broader history. So at the moment, all one can say is they're probably dating from somewhere around 400 BC to about 100 AD, which isn't particularly helpful, unfortunately.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I've got one of my own.
Oh, wait, I've just got one come up.
Yes, there's another one come up. Yeah, two come up. Yes. What value do you see coming from the store of documents found in the Egyptian Museum Storeroom and their translation, digitizing, fitting into the existing story in history?
Yeah. I think the discovery of documents have been really important. I'm not sure whether you're talking about, I'm not sure of anything being found in the store of the Egyptian Museum, but a whole load were found in a storeroom at the Abydos Temple, which may be the ones you're thinking of there, which are records of the Antiquities service from the late 19th century through into the 1920s, if not beyond. Provisional work on that really has shown a lot more about how the Egyptian Antiquities authorities actually worked. And particularly it's actually showing how much more important the roles of Egyptian Egyptologists were than the published work tends to suggest. It's quite clear from this material from Abydos, which an initial sort of readout has been published in Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, the latest edition of that, is that, so rather than that actually it's the local Egyptian inspectors who are playing a far greater role than had previously been sort of perceived, simply looking at the very much sort of the stuff written by Western Egyptologists. So I think that that group of materials, I think is what you're talking about there, is really, really important for understanding how the Egyptian Antiquities authorities developed and worked during that sort of key period of the late 19th through into the 20th century.
Okay, yeah, a couple of other questions. Much of the source material these early travellers were objects, sites. How about papyri? Yeah,
a lot of papyri was certainly being collected by these individuals, and particularly Harris, who was a merchant based up in Alexandria, but certainly travelled throughout Egypt, and the papyri he acquired are of great importance. But for historically, actually, and Harris's papyri are really important historically because they are records of trials of tomb robbers, and things like that. But most of the papyri which these early travellers were acquiring tend to be the pretty ones. They were the illustrated books of the dead and things like that, which from the point of view of my sort of particular focus on development of Egyptian history, really didn't really play very much role. And Derek's sort of suggest a question after about no mention of Belzoni, again because Belzoni's role in history is virtually non-existent. That's what I was trying to avoid talking about too much of these sort of almost the heroic treasure finders, as against those who are actually getting material which actually impacted on history. Although actually there is one thing which I could have mentioned on Belzoni, was that when he discovered the tomb of Seti I, Thomas Young had a look at the texts from it and made an attempt at identifying who the owner was. He got it completely wrong. He thought it was Psamtik II of the 26th dynasty. However, it was the first time ever that somebody had actually looked at the hieroglyphs in a new discovery and actually tried to make some sense of what that might mean in the context of placing that monument. And in fact, again, the way that Young did it is a classic example of trying to use what he had available. He saw that he recognised the letter P in the name of Seti Muremptar, which is the full name of him. And then he also noted there were figures of people who he read as Ethiopians on the wall of the temple, on the wall of the tomb. He then noted that, according to Herodotus, Psamtik II had carried out a raid against the Nubians, or Ethiopians as they were then referred to by scholarship, and that's how we ended up getting, again, completely wrong, just as Wilkinson was wrong, but in the light of what he was trying to do, using what data was available, it was actually quite a major step forward, even if it does seem rather ridiculous in modern times. So I think it's very important when you're looking at past people who are contributing to Egyptology, although things seem ridiculous in modern terms, you have to bear in mind how they're doing these things in the terms of the contemporary views. Next question: during the first half of the 19th century, did the Egyptian government take any attempt to make money from antiquities? No, basically I think what the Egyptian government was trying to do was actually make diplomatic capital out of antiquities. That permits were given for things to be done or things to be removed, very much I think so with a view as to what good that would do Egypt's position, because during the 19th century Egypt was still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but was desperately trying to break away from it and become a great power in its own right, and therefore I think that's where antiquities were regarded as having value, and one of the reasons why the first iteration of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was given away to the future Emperor Maximilian of Mexico to buy Austrian support. Next one, Sally Abed, thanks for interesting talk. I'd like to add that the medieval Arab scholars and travellers contributed to the reconstruction of Egyptian history. Akasha El-Dali's book, The Lost Millennium, Ancient Egypt in Medieval Arab Writings, shows the contributions of various individuals, including one Ibn Washia, who managed to read a couple of hieroglyphs in his work. So yeah, I agree that's something which is I probably skated over rather too much there. The thing is, I'm very much my interest is primarily in the actual writing of ancient Egyptian history per se, rather than broader issues. This is my current bit of research. Hence, the Arab scholars aren't bringing really very much to that, apart from when they repeat various legendary accounts of ancient Egyptian history, which are not available elsewhere, and that's possibly something which is maybe worth following up in due course, is where some of these stories actually come from, which differ from those which sort of crop up in Herodotus or biblical sources, even though they've probably got a similar kind of origins in sort of folk tales. Chris Elliott, could you comment on the early tendency to date the best preserved temples as the oldest rather than being Ptolemaic and Roman? I think the problem was before people could actually read anything, there's almost a view that society sort of declines, so therefore the best stuff may be the earliest stuff. And there's also a certain amount of wishful thinking as well around this. I think particularly about the thoughts about how to date the Dendrous zodiac. People want to try and make that sort of as early as possible. So I think there's sort of a bit of wishful thinking, and also the view that the oldest must be the nicest, I think. Next one could the 1890 travelers be spies for their governments? They could describe Egypt, photograph it, and collect information during a very difficult time with war conflict between the Ottomans, Egypt, Russia, Prussia, and so on. Do we know some travellers on diplomatic service? Well, certainly some of them are diplomats. We know that. People like Gravetti, people like Salt, and so on, are all that. But I don't think, but most of the others are generally just interested in Egypt per se. They might be producing information of use, but I wouldn't actually say that any of them are likely to be in the pay, as sort of the question sort of implies of that. I think one needs to bear a difference between the ones who are definitely diplomats, say Gravetti, Salt, and all that group, and the travellers. They all mix together, but any sort of transfer of data back to home government, I think, was more a question of this is stuff which is interesting, rather than it being sort of being in any way agents or spies in that kind of sense.
Other questions, yeah.
Just reading through.
Yes.
Robert Frost, yeah. A number of antiquaries, proto-Egyptologists were upper-class Britons who had a particular view of chronology, genealogy, their own family tree, and so on. Is there any possibility they imposed an overly rigid way of reading the king lists like royal family trees? I don't think they're imposing. These king lists are pretty transparent in what they are. They are, and certainly subsequent work has made it quite clear they are basically accurate as far as the order is concerned. They've been edited in the sense things are missing from them, partly due for political reasons like removal of Tutankhamun and that sort of group from there. Also editing purely for space as well. Certainly the Abydos list is that. But I think at this stage they don't really know enough to be able to impose anything on this. It's recording what's there and making an assumption that things are in an order. Correctly in the sense of the Abydos king list, incorrectly in the sense of the Karnak list, whose nature still is something which isn't a universal agreement amongst Egyptologists about. And Ashley raises the question of the Turin king list, yes, which is a papyrus king list found by Gravetti in 1820. The only reason I didn't really mention that was because of its severely damaged state, it wasn't really of much use until somewhat later on. That the parts which were really the Abydos list was by far more important at that stage. The Turin list's importance as a source for reconstructing history comes in a bit later in the 19th century, and I was very keen to just try and restrict it to the actual research being carried out by those particular people rather than just simply stuff they found which was later made use of.
Well, we've come to the end of what's on the Q&A list, and I guess time is getting on. It's getting on towards 9:30, so I think we probably need to draw this session to a close with renewed thanks to Aidan for a very fascinating talk and also enlightening answers to a whole range of questions. So we can't clap you, at least we can clap you, but you probably won't hear. So we'll just have to take my word for it, as I'm sure everybody who's heard it is very appreciative. So we hope we'll see some of you, or at least your number will come up on the screen, because we can't actually see you at some of the rest of the lectures in this series. And the next one is in 2 weeks' time, on the 18th of February, when we'll be talking about something completely different. And Maddie Bowden will be giving a talk on the monument to men massacred in the Sinai Desert in 1882. And for this and for the succeeding 3 lectures which will follow it, you should go to the STD website, and you'll get more details and also how to book. And we hope that we will see some of you there. And 2 other things just come up on the screen. In fact, no, most of them are thanks. No, I think we'd better close it there. Thank you very much, Aidan. Thank you all for coming, metaphorically, and we hope that you'll be following the series, and we'll be able to enlighten you on some totally different subjects in the remaining 4 lectures of the series. Thank you very much.
Good night all.